Welcome, everybody, to Spirituality Adventures. This is a non-judgmental place to explore spirituality, and we're so glad you're here. This is a viewer and listener-supported podcast, so we greatly appreciate your support. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Be sure and like, share, and subscribe to any of the social media content platforms that you're using. And then if you go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, you can make a one-time donation, or with a monthly subscription, you'll gain access to our bonus content. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you for tuning in. Hey, welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. Thanks for tuning into this episode. And I have Jonathan Foster coming back again. Jonathan did an interview with us back, I think, a couple of months ago, was it? 2 months ago. And we did 2 books of his, which I highly recommend. The first one is definitely a theological book that is not if you're a layperson, it's not an easy read. But if you want to dive into theology of consent, we'll touch on some of this today. I'd highly recommend it. Mimetic theory in an open and relational universe. Go back to our interview 2 months ago, and we kind of covered the highlights of this book. Any of you have ever gone through suffering or grief and tried to wrestle with the whole issues around God and life? This honestly is my new favorite book on grief. Who has favorite books on grief?
Yeah, right.
But I mean, there's some out there. Grief Observed, Pain, some of C.S. Lewis's work. And I've also heard Bittersweet. I haven't read Bittersweet yet by Susan Cain. She wrote a book years ago she wrote one called Quiet on introverts, which was excellent. Wow. But Brian McLaren's new book, Life After Doom, he basically has a whole chapter in there on grief. Wow. And Brian McLaren would say, if you read Jonathan's Indigo and Susan's book called Bittersweet, Brian's words were, you would have a master class on grief.
That's nice.
So, big, high recommendation for Indigo. So if you haven't checked those out, do so. But we're going to talk today about open and relational theology / process theology. And for some of you, if you've been listening to my podcast, you probably have heard me talk about this. But as I went through my doubts and questions about God's existence in my darkest hour a few years ago, one of the things I grappled with the most was my anger at God. And I still know tons of Christians who feel like that's so sacrosanct that you should never be angry at God, right? Right. But I honestly couldn't be anything else but that's all that came out from me for a while was anger, like anger at God. We'll get into some of these issues, and then that made me rethink all of God, including questioning God's existence.
Sure.
So I was either like, I'm not so sure God exists. In my darkest hours, this is how I felt. Yeah. These are more feelings. I never identified as an atheist, but I felt like one. And I struggled with the questions of God. And it felt like God had abandoned me. The darkness was overwhelming. And it literally just felt like God wasn't there. And then if God was there, I just felt anger. Like the only thing I felt like I could do is like cuss at God. I spent a lifetime loving God. And then all of a sudden I'm in this dark, dark place where I'm like, I just want to cuss. And my dad would wash my mouth out with soap. And he listens to all my podcasts, so anyway. No, but, so then I started, I started bumping into, I'll give my little introduction,
sure.
and I want you to give your introduction to how you came to open and relational theology. And then we'll get into a description of it and dive into that a little bit. But I started trying to find people who were making sense of a different concept of God than what I'd had. Not totally different, but there were things that were different. And where I started landing when I was reconstructing my understanding of God was in open relational and process theology. I'd say the person that helped me the most was I started listening to Homebrewed Christianity a couple of years. I just came to that a couple of years ago. So Tripp Fuller, who I actually interviewed Tripp just a couple of months ago on the book God After Deconstruction. I went to Theology Beer Camp last year. You were there last year. Then I just went to, I've interviewed Tom Ward 3 times. Tom's a big open relational theologian. We were just out in Wyoming together a few weeks ago with a big open and relational theology conference with a bunch of theology nerds, right?
Bunch of nerds, yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
So this was what started helping me to rebuild my faith in God.
Right.
Was open relational / process theology. Now, the weird thing, Jonathan, was that when I was at Baylor as a religion major, I was introduced to Whitehead and Hartshorn as an 18, 19, 20-year-old.
That is wild, yeah.
So I remember reading both of those guys, and Hartshorn was a little easier to understand.
Right.
And I remember thinking, this is interesting. It's like God's evolving like everything else. That was my 19-year-old brain's quick analysis of what I was reading in Whitehead and Hartshorn Process Theology. Like God's evolving with everything else that is evolving.
Well, that's not a bad takeaway. There's some truth there.
There's some truth there, right? But I didn't really dive seriously into it. It was kind of like an intriguing, but then I ended up being more of an Arminian theologian, definitely a free will guy, never a Calvinist. There were just too many things about Calvinism that I could not swallow. So then I've started doing I've reread Hartshorn. I'm reading lots of process and open relational theology now, including your book, Theology of Consent. So we're going to dive into what open and relational process is, but that was kind of, mine was a very real experience with darkness that caused me to question some of my foundational beliefs in God.
Yeah.
And that's what brought me to do a more deeper dive into this open relational process theology. Tell us your journey into open relational process theology, and then we'll start breaking it down for people. What is it? What's it about?
Sure.
Why is it important?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me back. I mean, twice in the same show. You were very brave. So thank you. And it's nice to be in person. We don't get to do that as much, so that's cool. Yeah, somewhat similar. I think my introduction to it came via like just trying to struggle with loss and what does this mean, and who am I, and who might God be, and the answers that had been given me that I had essentially been parroting my whole life, also as a pastor, also from an Arminian background, just didn't really work anymore. And it wasn't so much that I was like mad at people or at the church or at God as much as it just, these answers weren't working. And so I had to find something more expansive, something that was more interesting, something that at least didn't solve all the problems. I knew that probably was never going to happen. And that's true. It never does. But something that gave me at least a less sucky way to, work through some of these really difficult things. And so I was landing in open and relational world, officially probably 2015, 16, 17, somewhere in there.
Okay.
And Tom Ord, our mutual friend, we both come from the Church of the Nazarene background, so we have a lot of similar background. And so we got to know each other, and it was, in retrospect, it's quite obvious that it's not surprising that we hit it off. But an open and relational theology has been the paradigm that's helped me approach and reapproach love. Because turns out that's what I was really interested in all these years. I mean, I had interest in Christianity, but really I was really more interested in something deeper than the kind of Americanized Christianity that had been given me and that I was kind of like perpetuating. And it was really love. And I've always been like that. I just didn't have the language for it. I didn't really have the imagination for it. And so when I was able to approach and reapproach love, that was life-giving. And I was fine at that point, somewhere in those last, during that time, 2018, I was basically fine with leaving Christianity behind. But then, because of open relational theology, I was able to see, this is resonant with who Jesus was. And this definitely could be resonant with who the Jesus followers, what they could be doing. And so it just kind of reignited that whole thing. And even though I'm currently not pastoring, I'm super interested in trying to help. We're kind of in this awkward space, both of us really, trying to help people rally around this idea of love that could ignite a whole new movement of Christianity. And if someone's not a Christian, that's fine. But and we have a lot of open and relational people who aren't.
Right.
So that's pretty interesting. But for me, it really had a lot to do with love. And then that connected back with Jesus and answered some of my questions. Some of them it didn't answer, at least gave me a better framework to hold attention. And it's been life-saving, theologically for sure. Maybe even literally life-saving. So I'm really grateful for I'm not grateful for all the experiences that I had that led me there.
Holy crap. No.
But I'm grateful for the paradigm itself and for how it's helping me, process and navigate life.
Yeah. For those of you who missed the interview that I did with Jonathan, one of his daughters passed in 2015.
Yeah, New Year's Day,
2015. This book, Indigo, is really a open relational journey through the grief that you experienced. And so that's why I highly recommend this book. But yeah, the darkness that I went through engulfed me to the point where I didn't want to get up in the morning and I didn't really want to live.
Yeah.
And then that kind of darkness changes you.
Right.
Holy crap.
Yeah.
Even I've been preaching the Bible since I was 16.
Right.
I had doctorates and I was working on a second doctorate, and it still shook me to the core.
All the more reason why it did, because you were so vested in that thing.
Yeah.
Me as well. And so then when the darkness comes, and despite the fact that you've done all this other stuff, it's like, wait a minute, that's totally discombobulated.
Yeah. So let's just, people are out there, what are you talking about? Open relational theology, process theology, and why is it different? And how do you try to introduce that to people? I would kind of trying to just introduce to people this, what is this all about? What is open relational process theology all about? What's a starting place for you?
For me, there's a slight distinction between process and open and relational. Actually, in real world practical matters, there is really not that much of a distinction. But I often will say open and relational versus process because maybe you've had this experience too. But in my world, to say process, it was like just a pejorative term. As soon as I said process, people would, all the defenses would go up. For a whole bunch of reasons that, are probably for a whole nother podcast. But, Tom Ord, our friend, is the one who coined the moniker open and relational. And I've never heard him say this, but I've always suspected that half of the reason is just so that he didn't have to fight this whole thing that happens when you say, process, and it introduces to certain folks in the constrictive, evangelical world, it introduces a lot of anxiety. But so sometimes I'll call it process influenced open and relational theology.
Because there would be easily some people from the evangelical theological world that would probably think process theology was a heresy.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
So to name it, that's the kind of thing you can bump into.
Well, I'm sure you've had that happen. I've had that happen. mean, I've been called a heretic from a handful of different approaches, and the process part is one of them. Yeah. And it's still true with ORT as well. It's just, it seems to soften the blow a little bit. The other slight distinction is process tends to be a little bit more philosophical. ORT tends to be a little bit more theological. And I love the philosophical stuff, but I get in way up over my head really quick there. With ORT, I get in over my head as well, but just not quite as quick. Yeah. Anyhow, so the question is, what is open
what is it? Why is it important? What is it? How do we introduce this to people?
Well, so those two concepts, open and relational, go a long ways in explaining a lot of what it is. And I usually start with the relational piece because to me, everything kind of builds out of that. Although it's not non-linear, it's not linear. But so the relational piece has to do with the fact that essentially everything and everyone is in connection with each other. We are all entangled, to use physics language. We're all interconnected. When I say all, not just humans, but all of creation, all of nature, from the smallest to the largest, from the micro to the macro. So that seems to be the reality. Like the nature of reality has been telling us for a long time that everything is in relationship. We haven't always necessarily thought that. When I say we, I don't mean obviously you and I. I'm talking about humanity. In terms of science, it's really only been in the last couple 100 years that we've really more and more bought into that. I say that this whole way of thinking, there's tributaries that go all the way back into some Greek philosophy and those kinds of things. But in terms of science, like basically when we got to the age of enlightenment, so to speak, the age of reasoning, we kind of started buying into this Cartesian idea that that things are more substance-based and can be independent of each other. And so, even in science, we were looking for the fundamental building blocks in life. And we just kept going smaller and smaller and smaller to try to find it. You get down to the atom and you get to the the smaller, no matter where we go,
quark,
even in the quarks and all those things, everything's interconnected. And so the idea here is that the power really, like thinking about an atom, the power really isn't in the electron, neutron, proton. The power is in the relationship between the three and the way they interact. And so what's true at a micro level, I think is true at a macro level. Everything's interconnected. To talk about one thing is to talk about something else.
Michael Dowd, who passed away a little while ago, but he was a Christian who tried to always integrate evolution and concepts of God. But he liked to point out, like, your body, Jonathan, is made up of like the same stuff that stardust. 95% of what your body's made of is the same thing that was present at the beginning of 15 billion years ago, at the beginning of this, universe, and however it started unfolding. You're 60% genetically related to a banana. Like when you start seeing the genetic relationship among all living things on this planet, and then you start expanding that to the universe and the material connection. And then you start getting into physics and, butterfly effects and, something happens over here and it affects, it's just like the interconnectivity and I call that relationship, right? It's interconnection.
All of that, there are no credible thinkers in our world who are trying to tell us that you can like separate things out, whether it's, neurology or endocrinology or chemistry or science, math, physics, psychology, sociology. They all have to do with the way these things are related. And so what open and relational theology does is
but then to put a point, and then on a human level, the love that we want to be a part of, it's one of the basic human drives is to love and be loved.
Absolutely. If that's not relational,
that's relational to the core.
It has to be relational. It can't be some independent substance that exists somewhere. Otherwise, I don't think you would be able to call it love. So for sure. And so what open and relational theology does is it says, okay, this is the nature of reality, like relationality is. Not all classic theology has necessarily done that. Classic theology has wanted to say, no, there is separate stuff, So open and relational goes, no, it's all relational, and it takes care to superimpose all those things we're talking about over into the area of the divine too. So that God is somehow, like Ilia de Leo says, the divine entanglement, that God is in the middle of all of this as well. And it's super fascinating, and there's a bunch of implications because of the relational piece.
Yeah, I mean, for those of you who have dabbled in philosophy, if you go back to Plato's cave, and the shadows versus the substance, and then you get into Aristotelian where he saw substance more, not just in the shadow, but in the actual presence of who we, so substance, things that are separate, have a reality in themselves, separate in themselves. That's very much a part of Plato and Aristotle, right?
I mean, all connected with that.
They saw it a little differently,
right?
But still, they were trying to figure out the reality of nature itself.
Right, and some of those older Greek guys, so fascinating, the amount of intelligence that they had 2,000-3,000 years ago.
It's fascinating. With no modern science at all.
No, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And so some of those thoughts, come down to us that we're still, through evolution and thinking, we still kind of hold. Some of it we're, I may or may not agree with, but there's a lot to process there for sure. Yeah.
I mean, I've been doing mindful meditation, so I've been kind of doing a deeper dive into Buddhism.
Yep.
And like you talk about ancient philosophers, I mean, these guys predate all of that stuff. Right. And yet, if you look at some of their basic analysis of the nature of existence, dukkha is the word for suffering.
Okay.
And then anicca is the word for impermanence. Everything is changing. The nature of reality is change, impermanence. And then anatta is the nature of self, no self, or the changing self. Even the self is changed. So, and I'm not a Buddhist, but I find it fascinating that at the heart of the Buddhist understanding of existence, and this stuff even, some of this even predates Buddha, and thoughts around this, it's impermanence.
Yeah.
Which is the word anicca, which, by the way, for those of you who love the Bible, Ecclesiastes, the key word there is hevel, which it was just translated vanity. Everything's vanity. That's a horrible translation because it sounds pejorative.
Right.
The word is breath or vapor.
Okay.
It's almost linked perfectly to anicca, which is impermanence. Even good things change.
Right.
So you have this preacher who's trying to grasp life through all these different ways, and even the good and the corrupt is vapor, impermanence.
Yeah.
It's like an overlay. And some people think that Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, is the oldest book in the Hebrew Bible, predating Moses.
Wow.
So I find it fascinating that there's even overlaps in this concept with some of the ancient literature.
Definitely.
The nature of change, the nature of reality is change.
Yep. Yeah, that's so true. And how that connects with the divine has massive implications. We all basically inherited this classical idea of God that says that God can't change, but then boxed us into this idea that that change is bad, which is philosophically not necessarily true, because we would never say that about like a human. Like if you're talking about, hey, that person never changes, you wouldn't say that as a positive thing. That'd be a negative thing. But for some reason with God, that it is.
Well, and if your child doesn't grow in a healthy way, you start freaking out.
Exactly.
Right. Uh-oh, what's wrong?
Right. It really kind of doesn't make sense. And the other thing is, along with that, we have this idea that, if God had to change, it meant that he or she or it, whatever, was, in this tradition, it was always he. If God had to change, that would have meant that he wasn't perfect at some point, which then would instill doubt about our ability to trust. And I think what open and relational thinking has helped me see is that that's all just kind of a misguided way to approach perfection. So I'm not interested as an open and relational thinker in some kind of frozen, highly quantified state of perfection, but this quality of perfect beauty, which is always, and love, which if love is love, it has to be, because it's in a relationship, it has to be in the process of change.
So this idea that actually love allows for change and maybe even embraces change.
Yeah.
Talk about, because consent became a big important thought for you as it relates to open relational theology. Kind of weave those together with love, change, and consent.
Well, with my interest in love, I kept running up against this idea that, that had been handed to me and that I had adopted and tried to make work, which was that God is in control, and can organize and order everything single-handedly and make everything happen exactly like he wants. And that was problematic. I mean, it worked for a while. It's cool when you feel like you're on God's side.
I mean,
not mad at it.
and to talk Christian theology, I mean, Calvin would have been a person who thought that.
Absolutely.
God's in control.
Right.
He controls everything.
Right.
It's a fixed, preordained everything.
Everything.
It's like locked in, preordained.
Yeah, and we still have a large percentage of Americanized Christianity that still thinks that. And even the Arminian folks, which was interesting for me coming from this Wesleyan Arminian background.
And so for those you don't, Calvin tends to emphasize the sovereignty of God, the control of God over everything, even the future, it's all fixed. Mm-hmm. Whereas your Arminians were more emphasis on free will versus God's sovereignty, right? And so I'm just, for lay people.
No, it's good. Thank you for doing that.
So free will. So, and you and I would have been free will guys, and the way we would have done free will would have fit with the free will side of the evangelical world, right?
Right.
The way we did it, yeah.
But what's interesting is at a practical level, it still emotes, it still fleshes out for most people as a God of control when push comes to shove.
Dig into that a little bit.
Well, like, anything bad that happens, ultimately someone would say, even from our Arminian Wesleyan background, how many times did you hear, well, everything happens for a reason, something like that. Or I'm sure glad God's in control, or any number of things like that. And that's problematic because then what it does is that if God is in control and every single thing is happening for a reason, it takes my agency. So there's no point in me making any decisions. It robs any kind of empowerment. Well, again, on a human level, we would never want to be around someone who is stealing your agency and doesn't think that you're empowered and those kinds of things. It absolves me from the responsibility of getting involved to help create solutions to problems, because if this deity, if this thing controls, ultimately, kind of what's the point?
Using it, like, translate it into your parenting.
Yeah,
if you were a father of control,
right.
And you wanted to control your kids, like, show how that's not loving.
Well, I mean, you can try, like any of us who've had parents, you can try to control your kid. I'll never forget our daughter, she was our firstborn, and for about the first, about 7-8 months, I thought I had a pretty good handle on being able to pretty much modify her behavior and do whatever. But from that point on, it never worked. I literally remember the day sitting in an apartment with her thinking, oh crap, I can't control this little person. And then my next thought was, I need to make sure she doesn't know that I know I can't control her, at least for a couple of years, because I can't just have all chaos, break loose. Yeah. But your point is, that's a great way to put it. Like, could you call it a loving relationship if the parent could coerce the kid to do whatever, they wanted the child to do? Mm-hmm. You couldn't. First of all, you can't really do that. You can for a little bit when they're younger. But the bigger point is, you can't call that love. Mm-hmm. That's control. So for me, love isn't love unless the beloved has the freedom to turn their back on the lover. Which I don't love that, because when I play the lover part, it puts me in a very vulnerable, risky position, which I think, by the way, is part of the reason why a lot of people don't love this stuff, because we don't, and myself included, we don't want to be in that vulnerable, risky position. So consent became really important for me, like this idea that, no, the divine is interested in what I have to say. And a lot of that was birthed out of just a very simple, like, I don't know if it was some kind of mystical experience or if it was just, I'd never really thought about the text of Mother Mary, and the interaction she had with God in those opening pages of the gospel story, where thankfully at some point she says, "Let it be." And then I thought, how bad, and I'm not the first person to have thought this, I know, but how bad would it have been for that to not be a part of the story? That would mean that God just forced himself physically,
sexually. It's like God raped her.
Exactly. That's what it would be. Yeah. And I knew in my gut, that's not right. Yeah. And so I thought, God, that's so beautiful. Let it be. And then my next thought was, maybe the whole universe revolves around some measure of consent, even down to the smallest of things. It's very difficult to know how to quantify all that and explain and talk about all that. But I really like that idea. And what I think is that is a picture of love, and it stands in contrast to control.
Yeah, Mary's yes.
Yeah,
I'm so glad that was in there. Right?
I know. Otherwise, it's a bad story, man.
Then I've always thought, why didn't God, give twins and then have her give birth to a male and a female, and then the image of God,
There you go.
Well, then we could go. Why did then we could do the whole LGBTQ,
Well, maybe Jesus was more of a non-binary person anyhow.
Well,
then you get all the elements of.
That's what I'm. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I will say this: at some level, all of us, at least 50% of you is coming from your dad, and 50% is coming from your mom.
Right.
Well, that's interesting with Jesus, though, because the Christian story is, of course, it's not really Joseph. Mm-hmm. So that's a whole nother. Yeah, there's a whole nother spectrum.
I know.
Which I don't know how much I believe that story, but.
Well, I always bring out the tension of that because if you read Matthew, even Joseph didn't believe her.
Right, exactly.
It's like, really?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to divorce you.
Right.
Like if you're engaged to somebody and all of a sudden she says, hey, guess what? I'm pregnant. God did it.
Right.
Oh, okay. I think I'm out.
I'm going to tap out on this one. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, so I think too, one of the things that I liked about God After Deconstruction, I think Tom and Tripp put together a really good book of the kinds of real problems that people can have with God.
Yeah.
And they actually did a survey of thousands of people across America on, the issues that people struggled with as they related to God, and then broke those down, and then kind of tried to show how open relational and process theology can mitigate some of those questions that come up. So one of them's pointless pain. So like if God's in control, you're left with the Holocaust, 6 million people, or we go to Gaza right today.
Right.
And we've got over 40,000 deaths that are confirmed. They're thinking that once the rubble's excavated and stuff, that could skyrocket to 100,000 right now. And you're going, well, God's doing that, or God's allowing that, or God, and well, then why, if God could stop it, if God could stop the Holocaust and then doesn't,
that's a problem.
How? And then God's mystery,
right?
And so then we always jump to the mystery, but the reality is if you go through, I have a friend right now whose daughter committed suicide just recently. They're wrestling with the God question.
Yeah.
In the midst of this.
Yeah.
Why? And, as when we were Arminians, what would you say to that? What would you have said to that prior to diving into the open and relational?
There's a whole bunch of stuff that we say, but it really boils down, where you get to at the end is God has allowed this for some reason that is beyond our comprehension.
Right.
That's really, there's really nowhere else for it to go.
Right. Yeah. So I always think of it like this, like if you had a kid who didn't clean up his room or her room, and so you wanted them to learn a lesson, and so you probably wouldn't give your kid cancer to teach them a lesson, or you probably wouldn't kill them in a car wreck to teach them something, or to teach you something.
Right.
And God wanted your daughter in heaven,
right,
so that you could learn this lesson.
Yeah.
You get into these rationales, even I've had people, I can't tell you how many people, Jonathan, who've said to me, what I went through is that, God wanted to teach me stuff.
Right.
And well, there's stuff I've learned.
Right.
This is one of them.
Right. Yeah.
But I had to actually rethink my concepts of God through my own darkness.
Yeah. To put God in a situation where the only way we can imagine that this divine works is to have to make something bad happen in your life in order to teach you. I mean, that's not imaginative at all. That's not creative at all. You know, it's not patient. It's not any of those things that we would want to ascribe to like a fully functioning adult, let alone the divine. So it's super problematic. And I think one of the things that you're trying to speak to is this idea that if God is all powerful and good, which is what Christians have wanted to say, something breaks down. If God was capable of stopping the Holocaust or any list of these things that we've all experienced, or not that I've experienced the Holocaust, but that humanity has experienced, if God has the ability to do that and doesn't, how could you call that God good? And what's really interesting is like it's the atheist movement that kind of introduced that, at least for me, introduced that concept to me. And I remember one day being, oh gosh, I'm really thankful for the atheists who had the courage to say this and the intelligence to say this, because once you start to think about it, it doesn't work. And all that. So for me, what that all has to do is with love. You know, love cannot single-handedly control. I think love is still the most interesting and powerful agent and energy in all the cosmos. I just don't think that he or she can single-handedly do stuff, because the reality is everything's in a relationship.
So God is intimately connected to everything that exists in a loving way. Is that?
Yeah. Yeah, that a God of love is present to anything and everything at all time, and is capable of responding to us, but cannot force his or her will upon us, because if he could, then you wouldn't be able to call that love. And also, if God could, then God is culpable for massive amounts of pain, like unquantifiable amounts of pain.
Yeah. I mean, like I was, you know, nature itself on this planet is filled with death. Death, 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 death. It is almost like nature's a serial killer. Death, 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 right? Out of all that death emerges other stuff.
Right.
But the death is so present and real, you know, and you think about natural disasters, and you think about, you know, crazy things like car crashes, and you think about, and then with me, what I went through, like I did bring on some of it myself, like, you know, I've had to take responsibility for what I did wrong and certainly brought on, but, you know, I had a bad year and basically lost everything that I'd ever built my whole life on because I had a bad year and made some bad decisions in a 1 year stretch.
That does speak to the relationality of all things too. So
it does.
You weren't separate from all that. You participated, contributed, but there were other factors that came along with that, as it is with everything. Diseases, wars, car wrecks. Yeah. There's a multiplicity of factors that have to happen in order for both the good and the bad to happen. The reality we live in is relational, and also another part of the reality is entropy. I mean, death happens. But what you started to say earlier is like, also there's good stuff that's happened. And we've complexified in the midst of evolution, this complexity has emerged and continues. Something or someone maybe is luring, inviting that whole thing to move forward and to get, and even though it's really bad stuff, there's still really good stuff. It's hard to know what that is if you don't think that's God, although some people they call it lots of different things, I guess.
Yeah. So pointless pain is one of how evil or pain or suffering, the reality of that and all of its manifestations, the injustices that humans do to other humans, the planet's function of nature, and how tornadoes and tsunamis and things can just wipe out whole populations, and then how all of that, the human interaction with nature itself, all of this creates like horrible experiences that we humans can go through. And if it's God controlling all of this, it'd be like you as a parent inflicting all kinds of shit on your kids.
Right.
Even killing some of them. Like, let's say if you had 20 kids, you're going to take out 3 of them, and you're going to like give cancer to these, and then
to teach the others a lesson or something.
Yeah, and then these 2 are going to thrive and be wildly successful and have seem like no problem. You know what I mean? Like, and you're controlling, like picking favorites and deciding who's going to get this and that and the other, and you're just in the end, you're like going. Like for me, it was just like, do I really want to worship a God who inflicts this kind of pain and injustice onto his kids?
Right.
I mean, even the hell thing.
Right.
Like I still have people who are convinced that a loving God just delights some weird way in burning people for all eternity in hell because they didn't believe the right things, or they weren't born in the right place or the right time. Like if you were born before Jesus was born, or if you were born over to a Hindu family, and then God just goes, "Oh, well, hell, you're going to burn forever because, you don't believe the right things."
And that opens up so many problems. Like one of them you were almost just said, or maybe you just did, but like this idea that that Christians would be, that somehow God would be glorified in this, and that Christians would somehow celebrate this. I remember particularly after my daughter died, thinking through an exercise of, what if this was true? And what if I got into the next dimension and there is a heaven and a hell, and I find out my daughter's in hell? How in the hell would I be able to be thankful for anything or say that glorifies God? And also, what would my response? In that moment, my response would be, I'm going to hell. I'm going to go find her. Like, so if I wasn't in hell, I like this scenario that I'm assuming that I wind up in heaven, right? Between me and my daughter, trust me, she's in heaven, and I'm not. But I'm just saying the preposterous position that puts you in, and that you're then supposed to be thankful for that, it's untenable, and there's no chance, especially as a dad. I would never be able to enjoy heaven if that were the case. So that breaks down a lot of this thinking. And again, all of that has to do with love. It has to do with the uncontrolling nature of love.
Yeah, the uncontrolling nature of love. And so that's where I really, really doubled down on this stuff. And my new favorite verse, you know how you probably memorized thousands of verses like I did.
Probably not as many as you, but yeah, I did memorize a few.
I memorized whole chapters. Yeah, I did the whole Navigator's Bible memory system. I did all of that. I've memorized one verse in the last 5 years. 1 John 4:16.
God is love.
God is love. Those who live in love live in God, and God lives in them.
Yeah.
So that's become the controlling paradigm for my concepts of God now, and which makes me go back and look at like Tom's book, God Can't, and I interviewed him on that book. But it's like there's all kinds of things that love limits you in because of this control issue versus consent.
Right. And we adopt that kind of thinking in normal human interaction. We know that loving people can't control and there are certain things you can't do. But for some reason with the divine, stuff bogs down for people.
So this ancient formula that I think comes out of classical Greek philosophy, Plato, Aristotle for sure, but others too, is that there's this perfection God who's perfect in love, perfection God who's perfect in power, perfection God who's good, but then the world is full of death and evil and destruction. And so then you're left to explain that in these mysterious ways of how do you hold to this all-powerful, all-loving God who then is single-handedly just dishing out death and cancer and destruction and holocausts and Gaza, genocides and just on and on and on and on and on. And you're just like going, if that's God, I don't want to worship that kind of God.
Right.
If you were that kind of parent dishing out that kind of evil to your kids, we would want to lock you up.
Yep.
But when it comes to God, somehow God gets off the hook.
Right.
And I just think it's a wrong concept, right?
I do too. Yeah, an open relational gives us a healthier concept and flips that whole thing and says that the divine's actually in the middle of all that suffering with us, can't control it, is wooing us and luring us to make better choices. But because of our, mimetic penchant towards violence and sacrifice, we keep turning away from that. So it's turned upside down on its head.
I think one of the other things too that's important for me in open relational and process theology is the whole input of science. And so I grew up in kind of a weird, like in the Southern Baptist world, there were a lot of people who just didn't believe in evolution.
Right, sure.
Like they didn't think the universe was 15 billion years old. They didn't think the planet was however many. How old's the planet supposed to be?
4 or 5 billion. Maybe.
Homo sapiens are 200,000 or 300,000 years on the planet. I literally had people who were what they call creationists who tried. And I've always believed in the old Earth and an old universe. Okay, I've loved science enough my whole life, so I've spent my whole life trying to integrate my faith with science, right? But I literally had people who thought that God created the world in 6 literal days, that the Earth is literally 6,000 years old, that the whole universe is literally 6,000 years old, that there was literally an Adam and Eve. There were just 2 people. They started having sex together, and then they had kids, and then the kids and the parents all had sex together to create more kids, and then, and you just get into these bizarre, the design. I have one friend who said he was taught that dinosaur bones were put there by the devil to deceive people, that they didn't even exist.
Right.
You just get into like every legit hard science, from geology to astronomy to physics to biology, points to processes that go on that have been going on for
a long time.
A long time. So then for me to integrate those concepts with my faith was a huge, huge part. So how do I hold on to a God who is a part of billions of years of processes that bring us to us having self-awareness and consciousness and having a conversation here like we're having, reflecting on our own existence and the realities in the universe, that. But that was important to me to have, to be able to take the inputs of science as well as my faith. And this has also helped me hang on to God in the face of all of the revelation of all the sciences.
Open and relational, that was like one of the many extra benefits for me was, now I can actually entertain conversations with scientist types and be okay with whatever they decide, because I understand God is not this top-down, powerful, omnipotent, controlling kind of a thing, but this panentheistic, this interpersonal, omnipresent energy that's in the middle of this evolution that's all happening. And it matches up, by the way, with another nice short verse that you could memorize maybe this year. Love is patient.
Hey.
God is love, love is patient. And so if God is love and love is patient, well, okay, the patience of all of this over, all these billions of years, to the point where we are the universe reflecting upon itself, because we all come from the same kind of thing. So it's not like we're this separate substance. But I've loved all that about ORT. It's helped me. It doesn't have to be this false dichotomy between faith and science. It's all integrated into one big thing.
So let's do this a little bit for our Bible people who really committed to Bible who grew up with an evangelical hermeneutic, which is the way you understand, how you
Sure.
how you understand
How you
the
understand
Bible,
it, yeah.
how you read the Bible. What are some Bible passages? You mentioned one already with Mary. What are some other passages in the Bible that help you point to an open relational type of God and theology? What are some of your favorites?
Funny, we've been dropping Bible verses. Didn't even realize it.
Right.
It's nice.
I know.
There are so many when you start to look through it, and you start to read this through this lens of love that are then reflected in different ways. I mean, just the idea of, like, to me now, love is uncontrolling, non-binary, non-violent, non-scapegoating. It's in relationship. It's meant for the flourishing of everything. So anything I read that highlights the movement towards those things, I'm like, oh, that's super helpful. I mean, even Jesus quoting Micah or Hosea, where he's saying, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Like, God desires mercy, not sacrifice, is a way to illustrate some of what's going on. When I think about the Hebrew prophets and the way that they kind of chafed underneath the legalistic rules and the way they chafed underneath the structure of the Hebrew system, which this is not necessarily specifically directed towards the Hebrew system, because it's all human systems do this. But in the text, once you see the way they've ordered their civilization upon scapegoating violence and how they keep crying out on behalf of the immigrant or the foreigner or, and then you see Jesus, the way he lives his life, he is constantly interacting with the immigrant, the foreigner, the diseased, the female, the immigrant, female, diseased, divorced person, on and on and on. So I see it over and over. Also, I like the first verse I thought of when you said this was Paul's verse, in him we move and live and have our being.
Yeah.
I think of that all the time, like this.
From him, to him, and through him are all things.
Yeah.
Like everything.
I mean, that's a divine entanglement that's happening right there, and it speaks to open and relational theology. Yeah. I also think a lot of Genesis 1-2, the Tohu Vabohu, and the Spirit hovering over and within the chaos, and what was happening there. And now that I read Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, I see it less of God needing to separate things out in this, again, independent kind of a way. Although I do think love is constantly helping us create, and we can only create through boundaries. So there's some truth there. But they're just way more permeable than I was ever led to believe. And so open and relational theology, I was really surprised by that, like theology of consent, which was my dissertation. I got lost for a couple of months in Genesis 1-2, trying to figure out what do I think is going on before sin supposedly enters the world with Adam and Eve. There's a bunch of mind game, bunch of labyrinths you have to navigate there.
Yeah, death before the fall is one of them. Yeah. Because if evolution's there's been death going on from the beginning.
And if God is good, like we've been talking about, where does this serpent come from? This person who could tempt, because God's already declared it to be good. So there's a bunch of stuff there that you have to think through. But those are just a few things that come to mind when we talk about the Bible.
So, I was working on a Hebrew PhD, and I've translated all of that stuff and written actually a lot on it. And so Genesis 1 and 2, I think, actually beautifully meshes with open and relational theology, including what you've just pointed out. But even when God creates in male and female in the image of God, so when you go back to ancient Near Eastern studies, the image of God was an elitist term only for kings or queens. It's elite. You can't find anywhere in ancient literature except for this Genesis 1.
Interesting.
There's actually one text I found in a Egyptian text that might have hinted at the democratization of the image of God.
Okay.
But otherwise none. It's always an elitist term. And then here all of a sudden you have this text where men and women share in the image of God equally, fully democratized to every single person on the planet. And then you think about, and then you multiply, you co-create, multiply, all those words. I think even the word rule can be interpreted with love instead of dominance. Although that's a tricky one. That word is tricky, but I think you can actually do that even with the text.
Well, also image and likeness. So the likeness of God, the ability to change, to adapt, to grow that we have. I think, and you would know this better than me with your Hebrew background, to read that well means that we reflect some of this adaptability and this ability to grow.
Yeah.
I hopefully grow in love. I think that's what's helpful.
And then I think you can view covenant as a co-partnership, co-creation versus a top-down dominant idea. So I think the idea of covenant can be relooked at through this lens.
Everything. How about let there be? Terence Fredheim does a really good work on this, but just that thing, let there be, it's an invitation for this thing to happen. It's not God saying it has to be this particular way. It can be seen as let there be light, and then the universe responds in a way where photons and nuclear fission and things happen and light appears. And so there's always, once you begin to kind of see it this way, there's always possibility for this co-creative thing, for the relational, again, aspect of this to come back into play, which is super important.
And then I think if you take all of that Old Testament stuff, and even the Hebraic concepts of God, I think lean more toward an open relational God than a classical theist God of Greek philosophy. So I actually think the Hebraic concept of God, and most of your Jewish scholars that I've studied, and my favorite is Joshua Abraham Heschel. Yeah. He's definitely an open relational process guy. Definitely. And he has a great chapter in his book on the prophets called Pathos, which is a critique of classical deism from a Hebrew God perspective. And it's brilliant. But then you go to Jesus, and I think you see Jesus's teaching like fitting beautifully into this open relation. Let's close with the prodigal son picture of God. Think about that through an open relational.
Right. The story that Jesus tells that I think really should be called the gracious Father more than anything. Yeah. And how the Father, when the prodigal, there's 100 different takeaways, but the prodigal's out doing his thing, and the Father apparently is looking for him, because even as the Son is coming back, this embodiment of love, this gracious Father is out there searching for him. And the Son doesn't even have to really say anything when he shows back up. The love is so connected with him. It's not a separate thing. And also the way that Jesus has the Father respond to the older brother when he says, "You've always been with me. Everything I've ever had has always been yours." In classical theism, that doesn't really make any sense, because they've told us that we're supposed to think of ourselves as separate, and we don't have whatever, fill in the blank, grace, forgiveness, salvation. Jesus tells that story. It sounds like, no, actually love has always been with us. And we've always been with him, or it, or her. And I love that. Yeah.
And the Father's not controlling anything in the whole picture.
There you go. Yeah.
He's not controlling the younger son. He's not controlling the older son. He's not controlling the village. With the dynamics of community shame.
He's got a consensual village, relationship with his,
all of it, with the village, with and both sons. And then God is pictured as running to the younger, but if you read it carefully, he also goes out to the older. Yeah. He's constantly reaching and luring with all the dynamics in the story without control.
Right.
So
it's an awesome story.
It is. It's such a classic. But that's sort of what I've begun to do. My dissertation that I was close to completing for my PhD was on the kingdom of God in the Torah.
Wow.
And so I'm toying with the idea of trying to rewrite my dissertation.
That was what I was just going to say.
Through the lens of open relational.
How great would that be?
And I think it can, as I began to, because you think about the kingdom as like the divine commonwealth, like John Cobb talks about, and if you think about covenant as co-partnership, and the rule of God as an uncontrolling lure and co-partnership with all of creation. And then that unfolds into healing. Like a loving covenant includes like trying to take care of your people, trying to heal them, trying to keep them safe and protected, and this and that. All the different elements that are in some of these covenants that are in the Torah. Anyway,
That's a great idea.
I've been thinking about all of this stuff, and I'm like, I think it could really be powerful. And the Bible, for those of you who love the Bible, I think one of the mistakes that the evangelical world makes is assuming that the Bible only has one voice from beginning to end.
Right.
And the reality that it's written by multiple people, and it's edited by multiple people, and it's been edited and re-edited through generations, down to this thing that we look at now. If you try to reduce that into one voice all the way through, you really flatten it out and corrupt the Bible itself.
It's funny because I think people do that because they think that'll make it stronger, but in the end, it makes it weaker. Because like if you're with a regular person and they're just focused one track and they don't have the ability to hold different ideas in tension, you recognize right away this is not a very adaptive, intelligent person. So you're absolutely right. Univocal versus multivocal, there's no doubt that the multivocal provides more strength and health, and I love that. Yeah,
and it includes, like I like to say, the Bible includes bad characters. You wouldn't want to go out and emulate everything that Abraham did.
No.
Especially to his wife.
Most of the characters are not people you want to emulate.
And I think it contains bad ideas about God at times too. Definitely. Right?
Yeah.
Like there's some really bad ideas about God in some of those texts, right? But then there's these beautiful ideas about God that we're talking about.
Right.
And so recognizing that the Bible has, I like to call it maybe like a community midrash is what I like to think about it as. But so I'm excited. So one of the things that I'm going to be, Jonathan and I both have a heart to introduce open and relational theology to as many people as we can with maybe the rest of the breath that we have on this planet.
That's right. The waning amount of breath that I have.
Me too. But I got some left, right? I got today, here we are.
Right.
And so one of my things that I feel led to do with the rest of my life, other than build community and different things is to really double down on the concept of God's love and to inject all of our thoughts about God and life through this lens of love. And I love consent too. Like that, to me, that's the uncontrolling nature of love, the consent versus dominant nature of love.
Yeah.
And so, I'm grateful for the work that you're doing in this area. Glad we connected. Glad you're in Kansas City too, because that makes it kind of nice.
Yeah.
And so you will hear more from us on this topic. And I know Jonathan, you can check out Jonathan's Substack.
Yeah.
And
Jonathan_Foster on Substack.
And just your most recent, you write very consistently.
Pretty much every week.
This.
And like even today's was a very open and relational look at maybe what's going on in the next dimension, with objective immortality and those kinds of things. So
yeah. So stay tuned.
It's not good writing, but I'm just saying, we're writing on it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I'm kidding. Well, I'd like to think it's good writing.
Yeah. Well, I had one friend who said, if it's worth doing, it's worth doing poorly. And by that, he was trying to give himself permission to make mistakes instead of be perfect.
There you go. Yeah.
So that's how I look at it. It's like, well, I'm writing. It might not be good, but I'm preaching, but it might not be good, but I'm putting some good ideas
Absolutely.
out there.
Getting the reps in.
That's right.
You got to do it.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. You will hear more about this, I promise you, not just from me, not just from Jonathan, but other of our friends as well.
Absolutely.
I think that what's excited me when I went out to Wyoming, we were in Wyoming for a week at the Grand Targhee Resort, with about 50, 60, 70 other open and relational people from all different backgrounds and even from places outside of America. And there's a swell of people that's growing around this that are beginning to redo their thoughts about God, about life, and about theology and why we're here and purpose and meaning through this lens of the exhaustive love of God. You know, how wide, how deep, how vast is the love? You know, there's some beautiful passages that touch on the depth of the love of God. And to be honest with you, even my evangelical friends who would argue against us on some of these points, but if you double down on the love
piece, for sure.
I just don't meet too many people who want to move away from that love piece too far. Right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise you just end up into some.
No, it's a really good point, and it's been the through line for me all the way through to try to stick to that love piece. So I totally agree.
Yeah. All right, folks. Thanks for tuning in. God is love. Those who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. And I like to say, I've kind of been ending my church services with that and like saying, hey, if you stick to that, you're not going to get too far off track.
Nope.
So,
you're good.
In law of life, right?
That's right.
So, all right. Well, thanks for tuning in to this time. Thanks, Jonathan, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And if you haven't done so already, pick up Theology of Consent and Indigo. You'll be blessed. Thanks. See you next time. This concludes today's episode. Thanks for tuning in and listening. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Remember to like, share, or subscribe to the social media platform that you're using. And then go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, and make a one-time donation, or you can subscribe monthly and receive our special bonus content. Thanks so much.